Vietnam is a country everyone seems to have heard of, but no one really has a concrete opinion on. The people I've met while travelling either love it or hate it, with very little in between. Whilst its bustling cities and crazy traffic may be too much for some, there are also quiet paradises hidden away in the mountains, where Indigenous villagers live their whole lives away from the hustle and bustle of cities like Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh. Vietnam is the first country I visited in all of Asia, and whilst it was a hard place to start, the 2.5 weeks I spent there were filled with amazing experiences, leaving me with many wonderful and honestly some not so wonderful memories of this beautiful country. So join me as I venture from Hanoi, Sapa, Ninh Binh and Halong Bay in the north to Hoi An, Hue, Ho Chi Minh and Canton in the south, discovering this incredible country, its culture, its food and its people. I hope you enjoy. If you're new here, my name is Eowyn, and a couple of months ago I quit my job to travel the world. I started by travelling around the South Island of New Zealand for a month, but my first international stop was Hanoi in Vietnam. Living in New Zealand, it is so hard to get anywhere, so after 3 flights and 36 hours of travelling, we finally made it to Hanoi in the north of Vietnam. So after a pretty hectic drive from the airport, we just got to our hotel, and the streets are pretty chaotic to say the least, but now we're going out to go look for some food and kind of just see what the general vibe walking around is like. We tried to find a quieter place and ended up walking to Kiem Lake. Apologies, I'm going to mispronounce a lot of these as well, sorry. One of my favourite ways to travel and start to understand the place is to just walk around the street, stop and look at interesting things, observe people and see what the life is like and the kind of things that they do. After our little walk, we picked a random restaurant near our hotel, which was alright, not the greatest food I've ever had, if I'll be honest. But then we made our way to the famous, or infamous, should I say, Hanoi train street, where we were told that the first train would be coming through at around 7 p.m. However, we ended up getting kicked out by the police without a train in sight, and I know some people have had really good experiences with the train street, but I think it's 50-50 on whether or not you actually get a good experience. Some people have a great time and others kind of get a bit scammed, and unfortunately we were in the latter lot. The next morning we decided to wander around and explore the city, as the next day we had a city tour booked, so we wanted to be able to have a look around, do things at our own pace for a day and explore what we wanted to. We mainly spent the day trying to figure out how to cross the road and not get killed, as the traffic is obviously pretty crazy. We ended up at a train station, a super cool bridge, Halong Bay, a random market, and just observed the going-ons of life, trying to understand what the local culture was like. If you haven't heard of it before, Vietnamese egg coffee is a famous national dish which was developed around the time of the Vietnam War when milk was in short supply, so they ended up using egg yolk instead of using milk in the coffee, and I actually think it's really nice and better than regular coffee in some ways.
So we have banh mi, which is like traditional street food, and this is like a chicken one. It does not look like much, I'm sure it's going to taste good. So.
We followed the coffee up with some local street food, aka banh mi. These little carts are all over the country, but generally you'd be looking at paying anywhere from 30 to 60 Vietnamese dong for one, which is not that much at all, and usually they're pretty good. After we'd eaten lunch, we ended up walking back to our hotel and spent the rest of the afternoon resting, as the heat is pretty unbearable coming from a country which is rather on the cold side. So far we've just been going around and exploring Hanoi by ourselves, but today we're going on a tour, which is we're going to see some of the monuments and the classic stuff to see that we may or may not have been to, I don't really know. But that's what's on the agenda for today, so pretty stoked about that. And then tonight we're catching a train to one of the national parks. I can never remember what anything's called. I'll just put the name of it here because I can't remember things apparently, but that's what we're doing, so let's go. The next morning we got picked up for our city tour, and the first stop was Ho Chi Minh's Mausoleum, which isn't actually something I knew anything about, but essentially it's the monument which houses the preserved body of Vietnam's revered leader Ho Chi Minh. Obviously you're not allowed to film inside, but it was an interesting experience as I was definitely not expecting to see a dead body, but I found the reverence for him even this long after his death very interesting. I don't think I'm going to be able to explain it in words very well, but I definitely think it's somewhere you should visit in order to understand some of Vietnam's history, culture, and values. Our next stop was the Ethnic Museum, where we learned about the over 50 different ethnic populations in Vietnam. Obviously these come from many different areas, including Cambodia, Laos, Tibet, China, but mainly I found it really interesting to see that many ethnic populations can live in harmony, as New Zealand's history looks very different. We spent some time observing the different art forms, rituals, and ways of living, before making our way to the Temple of Literature, also known as the Temple of Confucius. Other than being built to worship Asian philosophy, it was also Vietnam's first university back in the early 11th century. It's basically a really long rectangle with a variety of different sections, which previously you would only be able to go through certain ones if you had a certain ranking or status. Nowadays, however, we just get to wander through and try imagine what it might have been like back then. The last stop on our tour was the Hilton Hanoi, or the prison that was used in the Vietnam War for both Vietnamese rebels and Americans. I didn't film a lot in here as it was very dark, both literally and metaphorically. I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but I definitely think it's a place you should visit in order to gain some context or insight into an aspect of Vietnam's and the world's history. Once we were done, it was time for some dinner, and we went to one of the best places for pho in Hanoi, just down the road from our hotel in the old quarter. We sat on the cute little plastic stools, which are actually kind of hard to sit on, and ate our pho. However, I do think that I'm not a big noodle fan, unfortunately, although I do think it was good. I just am not a big noodle person.
Oh, you have only the sugar cane.
Sorry?
You have any big lump?
Yeah, we have, yeah.
Bigger one.
We then caught a car to the railway station and managed to board our overnight train to Sapa without too much difficulty. However, the overnight train doesn't actually go directly there, it goes to a town nearby, and then it's about another 45 minutes by car to Sapa itself. So last night we took the night train from Hanoi through to the town near Sapa, but it's still about another 45 minutes by car, taxi, etc. to get to Sapa. The train took about 8 hours and I think I got a reasonable sleep, but it just kind of reminded me of being on a sailboat, so that was probably why I was fine. I don't think everyone else agrees with me. So today we're going hiking. We're going to go visit some local villages in the mountains. I think I might mispronounce this, the Hmong people, and so we're gonna go for a nice big walk, and the weather's not the best at the moment, but... On our first day, we were met by our lovely local guide Bao, who took us through the main streets of Sapa before leading us up an alleyway towards the mountains where we would be hiking. We ended up being held up a bit by some buffalo, as it turns out that the farmers use these regular old roads to move the buffalo up and down the mountains. Our main challenge this day was going to be the fair amount of hill climbing we had to do, as we would be ascending to near Vietnam's highest peak, Mount Caspian. Many of Vietnam's indigenous tribes still live in the mountains, so we were taking the route less travelled to reach them, seeing the sights along the way. However, for the first hour or two we didn't actually see much, as unfortunately it was really foggy and the weather was continually changing. Luckily, as we reached the high point of our walk, it started to clear a little bit and we were treated to glimpses of the magnificent mountains around Sapa. From here, we made our way along the ridgeline and back down towards one of the local villages of the Hmong people. If you've been on my channel before, you'll know that I've done a lot of hiking in New Zealand and also in Europe, and I'm usually pretty good at finding my way around as I have a really good sense of direction. However, up here, I feel like I would have instantly lost my bearings. So if you're planning on going hiking around this area, I would definitely recommend going with a guide rather than trying to do it yourself. We stopped for some lunch at one of the local villages, and oh my goodness, this has to be some of the best food I had in my entire time in Vietnam. Everything was so fresh and incredibly flavorful, as I had found that some of the dishes in Vietnam can be a little bit on the bland side, or at least a little bit repetitive after a while. The mango smoothie was one of the best things I have ever eaten in my entire life. I would definitely recommend coming here even if you take the short route to get there rather than hiking through the mountains. Something I find really interesting is how many animals there are just around. You're always stumbling across puppies or little chicks, and the bout of cuteness always makes my day. We made our way back down towards Sapa via a different route, crossing rice terraces, passing by little homes, and observing the different architectural styles. In the evening, we walked around Sapa for a bit before getting an early sleep, as we had another big day of walking to do. On our second day, we were heading into a more remote area that was going to take around an hour by car to drive through to. We were going to be meeting more of the local people, as we were visiting both a Hmong village and a Dzao one. At the first village, one of the locals was kind enough to invite us into his home, and it was interesting to see the open plan architecture and the way they lived. We asked our tour guide to ask some of the local people questions, as we wanted to learn a bit more about their way of living, and she shared with us that a lot of people who live there have actually never left the village. Even though nowadays the younger generation tends to leave to go to the cities or other places for university or work, they end up eventually coming back to their home village anyway, to raise their families or to grow old. I find this a little bit unusual, but it does make a bit more sense when I look at how important community and family is in Vietnam. It is still a little bit hard to wrap your head around though that people will leave and then go back, as I don't feel like that's a very common theme I've seen in a lot of other places around the world. However, there is something really nice about going to a place that feels like it's been untouched by the modern world and is reasonably similar to what it would have been 50 or 100 years ago, as obviously the rate of change in the world is incredible and quite hard to deal with. We got back a little bit earlier in the afternoon and we explored Sapa again, finding some more murals and looking at the architecture before heading back to the train station to take the overnight train to Hanoi. This train takes around 8 hours and unfortunately I didn't get the best sleep on it. Right now we are on the night train from Sapa to Hanoi and it's pretty basic accommodation but like it's still alright. It's about 8 hours through to Hanoi, so gonna read for a bit, go to sleep and then wake up in a new city. Sick. So they give you free chips and water, which I like, although the coffee is not free, don't get scammed into it. So there's the top bunks, which is what I am on, because I have been reading this beautiful book by Murakami that I like. And yeah, Ninh Binh is around 3 hours drive out of Hanoi, but it is well worth visiting on your trip to Vietnam. The first stop on our explorations around the beautiful area was Cuc Phuong National Park, which is the oldest national park in Vietnam. It's completely beautiful, almost untouched wilderness, with butterflies and animals everywhere you go. You do have to buy a ticket to go in, but once you're inside, there is plenty to explore. The first place we went to was an ancient tree, which was absolutely immense and gave us the chance to walk through the forest and experience the biodiversity and different climate there. It was really challenging walking in the hot weather, but we cooled down afterwards when we went to visit the cave of Prehistoric Man. This incredible cave was used as a shelter over 7,500 years ago, which is pretty crazy to think about. We explored a variety of different chambers and even turned off all our lights just to absorb the pure pitch black darkness, which for some people would be horrible, but for me was a very enjoyable experience. Near the entrance of the national park, there is a primate rescue centre and breeding program where they house over 24 different species of primates. They even have a section where primates are free to go back into the wild but can also return to the safety of the centre if they choose to. They've had over 200 primates born there, most of which are critically endangered, and they're also a not-for-profit organisation, so it's really cool to see the degree of success that they've had. All of the monkeys were really cheeky and I absolutely love seeing the different names they've given each of them. It was a really cool experience and something a little bit different to a lot of the other things I did on my trip around Vietnam. Obviously all of that made for a pretty big day, so we just went back to our hotel and rested up before heading the next morning to the Lying Dragon Mountain, which is a UNESCO heritage site. You have to walk up a lot of stairs to get to the top, but the view and the dragon monument, which was built in the 16th century AD, are absolutely worth it. incredible place to be able to go visit, and we were also lucky enough to run into a bunch of people in traditional Vietnamese clothing as well. Something I've noticed as I've been traveling Vietnam is that there are a lot of people in traditional clothing taking photos or similar all over the place, and even though I do wonder if it's a bit of a self-indulgent thing, it is really cool as a tourist to be able to see people in these traditional garments. After spending quite a while taking in the incredible views, we went back down to the bottom to enjoy the lovely Lotus Lake, where there's a variety of walkways around hundreds of lotuses in different stages of blossom. It was absolutely gorgeous and would definitely make for a great photo on Instagram. We then drove a short distance to a nearby village and rented some bicycles to go and have a look and see what the local life was like. We visited a temple, saw people fishing and enjoyed the scenery as we cruised around on wheels. We then had a quick lunch, and if you need to know anything about food in Vietnam, it's that the spring rolls are pretty much always the best option on the table. We then headed for a slow boat trip along the river. Unfortunately, even on the water, you can't escape people trying to sell you things, so there are people on little boats with cameras trying to sell you a photograph of yourself. I don't know how they would get it to you, but I thought it was an interesting and very lucrative business choice that probably isn't that successful. However, once we'd passed the photo boats, I had a great time looking up at the majestic mountains, including the Dragon Mountain that we'd visited earlier. We ended up passing through 3 different caves, and as we just travelled along, it was very relaxing, so I honestly almost felt like falling asleep. It was a wonderful experience. It was really calming and just so magical to be able to look up at those cliff faces. I think that how we spent our time in Ninh Binh was a really good way to do everything, and I would definitely recommend this sort of itinerary if you're planning on going there. Halong Bay is around 2 to 2.5 hours drive out of Hanoi, and we took a bus to get there. I think that going for an overnight cruise rather than a day trip is definitely a good idea, as you really get to relax, you get a sunset, a sunrise, and you get to soak in the scenery. Whereas in a day trip, I think you're a little bit rushed. So even though it costs a bit more, I definitely think it's worthwhile to do an overnight or even a 2-night cruise. After waiting for a while, we were transported to our cruise ship on a smaller boat, which took around half an hour to get from the dock to the midst of Halong Bay. After that amazing lunch, which is like the best thing I've ever eaten, I don't know how they made pasta better than I had it in Italy, but they did it. In Vietnam, I don't know. At any rate, this is one of the most beautiful rooms I have ever seen, and I'm so stoked. We then stopped at a bay where we were able to go sea kayaking. It was really cool to be able to be at the water level and then look up at those immense cliffs and then go for a swim afterwards, even though I'm not really sure how clean the water is there. A great thing as well is that all the activities are optional, so you don't have to go out and move your body if you don't want to. You can just be a complete slob. Because I wasn't sure how clean the water was, I had a bath and spent a bit of time reading and relaxing before an incredible 5-course dinner. I actually thought the lunch was better, but the lunch was literally the best meal I had on my entire trip, so it was pretty unbeatable. The next morning we got up early to see the sunrise, and we also did a Tai Chi class, although I didn't film that. There's something very magnificent about being in Halong Bay that is kind of hard to describe or explain on video. I think the best I can do is just to say that it's an unforgettable experience and something so magical that it just feels completely different and distant from anything else in Vietnam. Also, it vaguely reminded me of the Marlborough Sounds at the top of the South Island of New Zealand. It was nice to be reminded of home in a way, especially being so far away from it. After watching the magnificent sunrise, we took a bus into one of the islands where we visited a really cool cave, but once we'd finished that, it was pretty much time for us to head back to the dock and go back to Hanoi. I think my main disappointment was that overall we only ended up spending about 24 hours on the boat, even though it was a 2-day tour, as by the time you get there and then you leave around midday, you don't really get to spend that much time there. However, there is a 2-night 3-day option, which I think probably would have been a better choice. From here, we travelled back to Hanoi, where we then flew down to Da Nang. I definitely enjoyed this experience, and it was really nice to be able to feel like you're living in the lap of luxury for nowhere near as expensive a price you would pay in other places in the world. I think Halong Bay is a must-visit place in Vietnam, along with Ninh Binh. We'd previously had a couple of relaxing days in Halong Bay, so we arrived in Hue ready to explore, and we started off by doing a city tour, with the goal of visiting some of the historic sites as well as a few new and unique places. We made our way via boat to our first stop, the Fairy Lady Pagoda, which, other than having one of the coolest names ever, is the oldest pagoda in the city of Hue. We saw a lot of monks here, and honestly, out of all the pagodas I've been to, I was actually really impressed by the architectural design and layout of this one, as it's one of the most aesthetically pleasing and calming and well-designed environments that I've been in. After enjoying the tailor-made environment, we were on our way to visit the Citadel, or the Imperial City, which is the home of Vietnam's last royal dynasty, the Nguyen Dynasty. This place was absolutely immense, and I think you would need multiple days to be able to look around all of it, but unfortunately we only had a few hours to spend there. I've mentioned this before, but when I visit places that are owned by the government, royalty, military, or high-ranking officials, etc., I find it really interesting to think about how much money is going into these places compared to what goes to the general population. If you look at the opulence of some religious temples, tombs, and palaces compared to the general day-to-day life of a person in that country, it's a pretty extreme difference, and this place was definitely a very good example of that. It was also really interesting to be able to learn a bit about the history, as one of the kings had over 350 wives, which is kind of crazy to think about. Spent some time learning about Vietnam's royal history. It was then time to learn a bit about the Vietnamese afterlife, or the royal tombs. We made our way to Mang tomb, which is considered the most majestic, and I have to be honest and say that I love and also hate visiting the tombs because they're such beautiful architectural marvels, but at the same time, even if you believe in an afterlife, I don't think that can be that based in the physical realm, so that money could really be so much better spent elsewhere. It was incredibly beautiful to look at and so well designed, but at the same time it seems to be a little bit of favoritism compared to the regular old graves that most people get. We then visited another nearby tomb, which unfortunately I can't find the name of, but it was also incredibly beautiful, and I did prefer this one to the previous as it blended into its natural surroundings very well. There was this beautiful, harmonious blend of nature and man-made construction. We then visited a place where they make incense, and I even got to have a go at making some, although I must say that the locals are definitely much better at it than we are.
Not easy, right?
No, it's not easy.
Not easy, but not easy.
It's absolutely not easy.
No, it's very hard.
Well done.
Totally. Roll.
Cut it down. Cut in the middle. It's finished. Good job. You can stay here for cooking. Stay here one night for.
We stopped for an afternoon coffee and then I managed to find a cafe that had a piano in it, as I taught myself how to play piano by practicing nearly every day, and so whenever I don't have access to a piano anymore, I always get really worried I'm going to forget every single thing I've ever learnt, but luckily I have found that's not the case, and even though I was a little bit shaky, I still managed to pull off Interstellar reasonably well. We then had some banh mi for dinner. We'd spent a few days in Hoi An, and there are two ways to travel from Hoi An to Hue. You can either take the inland route, which is slightly shorter, or you can take the scenic route, which goes along the coast and over the mountains, offering incredible views over the sea. As I mentioned before, Masoleum was built from the 4th to the 14th century, whereas Angkor Wat was built in the 12th century onwards, meaning that Masoleum massively predates Angkor Wat. And even though it isn't quite as extensive a site, there is a mystery here that has been frustrating archaeologists for years, which is, why did they build the temples where they did in the middle of Vietnam, and also how did they build them? At present, there is a joint restoration project going on between India and Vietnam. However, the areas that they've restored look completely different to the original buildings, and the reason why is because of a technique that we now seem to have lost, which enabled them when building to somehow almost fuse the bricks together, preventing weeds and moss growing on the brick.
Sacrifice human. Now, I told you, something missing here.
The areas that have been restored in the 21st century are already more weathered than the sections that were built over a millennium ago. This is absolutely crazy to think about, even ignoring the sacredness of the place, which is hard to communicate through video. Unfortunately, some temples were bombed in the Vietnam War, so there are a couple missing, and you can see the impact of the bomb craters. There is a small fee to go in, but a lot of that goes towards the restoration and maintenance of the site, which to me is well worth it, particularly when you also consider that you get to experience a traditional Vietnamese dance when you are there. The show is put on around every hour and draws a big crowd, as the grace, style and execution is pretty incredible to see. There's always a story and a bunch of hidden meaning lying within the dance, which I think is really cool, as these stories are always very unique and specific to the place that they were created. After we finished exploring Masoleum, we had some lunch before taking a boat down the river back to Hoi An where we were staying. We rested up for a bit before heading out to get dinner and experience the old town lanterns and lights that Hoi An is famous for. We stopped at a little cafe in an alleyway nearby off the main street where you tend to get haggled, but it was so easy to miss as even when I was looking for it, I walked straight past it. However, it was absolutely fantastic and I wanted to go here because it had really good reviews. The owner of this place was absolutely lovely and we had a variety of dishes and a great smoothie, and all I can say is that the food was absolutely delicious and the vibe was fantastic, and it was so nice to not be on the main street with people everywhere. From there we checked out the night market that a lot of people visit Hoi An for, with its incredible lanterns, lights and tourist traps. It was very pretty to look at, but unfortunately there isn't much to do other than looking, to be honest. It was very beautiful, but after being haggled quite a bit I quickly decided I wanted to leave. The next morning we got up bright and early to go to a cooking class. We were picked up by our lovely guide and we biked to one of the local markets where we picked up a few things before we then biked out to one of the more rural areas to do some cooking. But before we could even get our hands dirty in the kitchen, we had to get our hands dirty working in the garden. The cooking class we did is a family-run business that hasn't been operating for a very long time, and the granddad, who is the farmer, took us out and showed us how they do things and explain stuff about their land, which was a lot of fun. He had a great sense of humour and was an absolute joy to be around. We also made some of the best food I have had in Vietnam, even if I got fire in my face while I was cooking it. We biked back to our hotel to get ready for our flight to Ho Chi Minh. We arrived in Ho Chi Minh late in the evening, and even at the later hour of the day, it was like entering a furnace. It was so hot, and then we drove through incredibly hectic traffic to get to our hotel. It was absolutely crazy and pretty immersive from the get-go, so we just walked down the road from our hotel to get some delicious food. I have to say that serving fried rice and a pineapple is a crazy idea, but one that is absolutely worth trying. All of our food was delicious, and we then got an early night as we had a city tour booked the next morning. Our first stop was the Reunification Hall, which has to be the most satisfying, beautifully built, architecturally incredible designed building I've ever seen. It went through a few ownership changes throughout the war and was originally built by the French, but then that got leveled and it was redesigned by a Vietnamese architect, and I have to say this place makes me want to become an architect. It was obviously absolutely stunning visually, but there was also so much hidden meaning in every single thing about the design. I want my house to look like this. Everything is just beautiful. There are so many different rooms, so many different styles, but the overall design is really cohesive. We then went to the old post office and Notre Dame Cathedral, two colonial style monuments which both have a bit of history, and even though the cathedral was under works, it was so beautiful to see. I also sent a postcard to my friend in America, which hopefully has arrived there by now. We then went to the War Remnants Museum, where I cried a lot, as obviously they have a full history of the Vietnam War along with a bunch of photographs taken by what I would believe to be some of the most admirable and courageous photographers in the world. We also learnt about the ongoing effects of Agent Orange, which is the chemical that the States used in the war. We then went to visit the Choo Choo tunnels, which were built by the Vietnamese comms during the war and total around 200,000 K, even though there are now very few of them. Even though the US had so many advantages in this war, it's easy to see how the Vietnamese managed to outsmart them using the advantages that they had, which were mainly knowing the terrain and the landscape really well. They had a lot of traps set up and things that were absolutely lethal, so it was really cool to be able to see, if not a little bit scary to think about the reality of. You could even go shooting at an air range if you wanted to, but it was a bit expensive and I'm not a big fan of guns anymore, so I passed it up. My main deduction from today is just that war is bad and we shouldn't do it. That's it. I'm in the bum tour of a B-52. Quite big. I'm not good at size estimates, but it's big. It's very big. The ground's like well above my head. It's probably like 2 meters. I don't know. We then went through one of the tunnels for around 100 meters, and honestly I found it to be a lot of fun as I'm not super claustrophobic, but it was very tiny, very narrow, and I would hate to think about how cramped and claustrophobic it would end up being if you spent long enough in there. The next day we left Ho Chi Minh and headed south, where we stopped at a few temples along the way, which were incredibly beautiful. At our first stop we tried some local honey tea with bee pollen, honey and a little fruit, which was absolutely one of the best things I've ever drunk. Okay, trying the local specialty, honey tea. We then took a boat cruise through the Baldwin Canal, where we entered Bến Tre Province, or the land of coconuts. This was such a calming and relaxing ride, even though the canal was obviously very small. We then visited a coconut candy making shop. These were super simple to make and pretty healthy technically, but they were absolutely delicious. However, we were pretty hungry, so it was time for some lunch. We had some delicious food, including a deep fried local fish, which was one of the best things I've ever eaten and like the nicest fish I've ever tried. We then headed to Kanto City, where I found one of the most beautiful bridges I have ever seen in my life. It made me feel like I was in Singapore or some sort of big city like that, and I loved getting some of these beautiful shots. We got up at 4:30 AM to catch a little boat up the river to go visit the Kairang floating market. It was really interesting to just see what life living on a river as the home base was like. It was actually a little bit crowded on the river, but that just made it exciting. We even saw some kids driving the boats, which was pretty cool but also a little scary. Along the way we stopped at a crocodile farm where we were able to eat them instead of them eating us. It was a bit intimidating when we arrived at first because they were all lying there super still and we actually thought they were statues. Then one of their keepers brought some food and they went absolutely crazy. It was pretty scary but also kind of cool. Honestly, they didn't taste that nice either, so I don't really want to go back, but it was an interesting experience.
It's a duck. Duck.
It's a duck.
We then made our way through by car to a much less popular place in Vietnam, Su Capjut Forest. This delicate mangrove landscape covers over 800 hectares and it's kind of like a wildlife preserve that's home to many different species of birds. First of all, we took a little boat with just enough space for 3 people around a small canal lining the forest. It was incredible how lush and green everything was, and also how well they'd integrated their tourism with a respect to the environment, as you almost wouldn't be able to see the route the boats take if you didn't look too hard. The boat ride was absolutely magical. We then moved to a long motorboat which is called takrang by the locals. It's a very common means of transportation in the Mekong Delta region. These boats can actually go pretty fast, or at least they feel very fast. We went down the river to a 14-metre high watchtower where we enjoyed an incredible panorama of the forest, and we could even see the Cambodian border from there, which was quite cool. We then headed to our hotel in Chau Dock where we were so we could take the speedboat up the river to cross the Cambodian border and head to Phnom Penh the next day. I hope you've enjoyed this last entry of my time in Vietnam, and I just want to reminisce a little bit about the entire trip, but I'll see you in Cambodia next week.